Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the convener of the Social Capital Research Group. Our group is an international collective made up of academics and postgraduate students, as well as government and non-government researchers and people who are interested in social capital, just generally speaking. We have an active discussion group with over 1,200 members, and we hold regular webinars with invited presenters. So in this session, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Trent Engbers from the University of Southern Indiana for a presentation and discussion about putting the capital in social capital. Trent is the acting assisting dean of the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Southern Indiana, an associate professor of political science and public administration, and director of the Master of Public Administration program. I'm sure all of you will have read his 2017 article, Theory and Measurement in Social Capital Research, which I found certainly a really important publication on social capital and something that's incredibly valuable. He co-authored that with Michael Thompson and Tim Slaper. So welcome, Trent, and over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be a part of this group, which, as we were discussing before the live stream began, has really grown into something that's impressive. The number of resources, the number of members that this group is putting together is really making a significant contribution to the field. I wanted to begin a little bit today with my interest in social capital. You know, I was told by Tristan that there's a pretty critical mass of graduate students that are involved in this group, and my interest in social capital really emerged out of my experience as being a graduate student. You know, when I was a student at Indiana University, I was getting my PhD at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and it was 3 years into my degree, and it's pretty clear I was going to finish in 4, and I needed a dissertation topic desperately. And so my principal advisor at that time was a man named Jim Perry, who's a very prominent scholar in the field of public administration. But I will tell you, my professional path up to that point had really been around nonprofit management. I think of myself primarily as a scholar of the nonprofit sector. And so he and I developed this idea that we were going to meet every week, and I was going to do a series of readings, and we were going to brainstorm topics. And so each week I would come in and say, what about this? Do you think this would be a good dissertation topic? And every week he would say, no, that's a horrible dissertation topic. I mean, over the course of a semester, I probably brought in 70 topics, none of which he liked. So much so that he started to suggest topics, none of which I liked. And then we came to social capital, and it was a unifying factor, right? It had this broad appeal that had both a public sector and a nonprofit sector dynamic to it. And I think that speaks of the power of social capital. And so that started me on this trajectory of studying social capital, and it's led to a very robust research agenda, and I've had no reservations about it whatsoever. And so I will tell you, many of you have registered for this webinar, and some people submitted questions in advance. And one of the questions I'm going to start off by trying to answer right away. Someone asked, what is your favorite approach to social capital? Or what is the best definition of social capital? And so I'm going to actually begin with a poll. So I'm going to ask the organizers, Marion or Tristan, if you can launch that first poll. What we have here is 4 definitions of social capital. So the first one is networks together with shared norms, values, and understandings that facilitate cooperation within and among groups. 2, the networks of relationships among people who live and work in a particular society, enabling that society to function effectively. 3, the aggregate of the actual or potential resources which are linked to possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance or recognition. And 4, the ability of people to work together for a common purpose in groups and organizations. So which one of those is the best definition of social capital? I'll give you a few minutes. They're starting to come in. Maybe another 10 seconds. You still want to vote? They're shifting. We've got some more voters. I said 10 seconds, but we still have some more activity. I'm going to give it just another moment. All right. So I'm sharing the results. So the most popular option was number 3. The second most popular option was number 1, though we have a little showing for option 2 and option 3. So when I think about this question, what is social capital? The long and the short of it is all of these are appropriate options, right? So if we go to the next slide, you can see that there is a basis by which to judge these, right? So the first one comes from the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development. The second one is a dictionary definition. The third is, that early definition by Bourdieu. And then the fourth one is Fukuyama's definition. And so, all of these are legitimate answers. There's not a correct answer to social capital for the purpose of these options. But I will share that I like the Bourdieu definition of this more than the others because it is the most capital focused. It's the most capital focused. And so let's look at a few other definitions, right? So we have the Bourdieu, right? And he stresses that capital component, the aggregate of the actual or potential resources, right? So this is that social capital is a resource to be used for something. Or we can look at Coleman. Social capital is defined by its function. It's not a single entity, but a variety of different entities having 2 characteristics in common. They all consist of some aspect of social structure, and this is the part that's important to me, they facilitate certain actions of individuals who are within the structure. Or if we want to go to Putnam, features of social organizations such as networks, norms, and social trust that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit, right? So these are resources that facilitate a particular benefit. And that capital component, I believe, often gets lost in some of the research that is done on social capital. That social capital, for many researchers, becomes a synonym for relationships or networks, and loses track of that capital dynamic. And so I think about it this way. So I've got 4 kids. I've got 2 daughters. They're both Girl Scouts. I don't know if anyone else has a Girl Scout, but Girl Scouts in the United States, like they do around the world, are famous for selling cookies, right? Everybody wants these cookies. And if you're a parent of a Girl Scout, then you've probably had an experience where while your Girl Scout may sell cookies, some of the responsibility for the selling of the cookies falls on the parents. And so there's a lab here for understanding social capital, right? Because, and so if you're, let me put it this way, if you are a graduate student and you're looking for a good research study, here's the study for you. I am interested in whether or not Girl Scouts whose parents work in large workplaces sell more cookies than Girl Scouts whose parents work in small offices. And I can't believe that they do. I mean, I can't believe that they wouldn't. Because, I'll go to the faculty lounge, it's down the hall, and inevitably someone has put out the sign-up sheet to buy Girl Scout cookies for their daughter. And so if your parent works in a place where there's a lot of people traveling through, then that gives you access to a network of customers who, either because they love Girl Scouts or they feel some sense of indebtedness, or because there's a norm of reciprocity, end up selling a lot more cookies, right? So those relationships have an economic impact in terms of raising funds for the troop. And as I will try and show later in this presentation, we see this in a wide range of environments. And so making sure we don't lose track of that capital component of it. Now, I must admit that this is a little bit of a hypocritical claim. I wondered why I was invited. And Tristan referenced this article in his introduction, so now it becomes much clearer. Because certainly out of a lot of my research on social capital, this article is the one that has gotten the most traction. This is an article that really looks at how social capital has gotten measured. It's an article I wrote with Michael Thompson and Tim Slaper. It's been pretty influential. And I will recognize that in this article, I often lose track of that capital component. Because what this article does is it looks at archival data. And it looks at all of the studies that have been done on social capital. I mean, not all of the studies, but lots of studies that have been done on social capital. And tries to understand what were the measures that were used and how might we make sense of those measures empirically and conceptually. And so in that sense, it's unconnected to the capital portion of social capital. But given the fact that this group is heavily driven by people who are doing social capital research, I thought it might be worth spending some time talking about the methodological opportunities that this study presents. Because the argument that I make is that social capital has come to mean many things to many people. And that's just the state of the field, for better often and sometimes for worse. And for me, that's not a problem, right? I don't see it as an obstacle, but rather say, well, let's take a look at how people measure social capital and understand what that tells us about the concept. And then later we can take that concept and apply it towards some dependent variable, trying to understand those instrumental ends. It's a paper that's about measurement and not about the many different debates about bridging or bonding or linking, though some of those conceptual elements flow through it. And, rather than starting with the theoretical and trying to build into measurement, I start with understanding the measurements and try and make theoretical sense of those. And so really what we find from these dozens, if not hundreds of studies of social capital that we looked at is that social capital has tended to fall into 5 categories. The first being social trust. This is the classic example of this is the GSS question that asks, do you believe that most people can be trusted or that you can't be too careful? But certainly questions of trust look at trust in institutions, trust in police, trust in workers, trust in government. Some people have looked at crime as an indicator of understanding social trust. The second type of social capital is formal membership and group participation. These studies tend to look at the number of membership groups, right? So then how many groups are you a part of? Though sometimes there are questions that look at binary involvement. So are you a member of a political group, or are you a member of a youth group, or are you a member of a social group? But trying to get that group membership component. The third being altruism. If I had to do it all over again, I don't know if I would use the word altruism. I mean, certainly there are indicators of altruism that fall within this category: hours, volunteer hours, money donated. But this category also includes a range of political activities that may or may not be altruistic. And four, informal interaction. So if we talk about bowling alone, this is, are you a member of a bowling league? Do you play cards regularly? Have you talked to your neighbor? There's been some really interesting research on economic development that has looked at patent collaboration. So if you haven't looked at that, that's a really fascinating body, both methodologically and in terms of the findings. And then lastly, shared norms. A lot of these look at kind of congregational membership. I've done some work that looked at kind of plurality of votes for a political party or plurality of membership in different identity groups as a way of trying to understand shared norms. And so we really categorize these into 5 categories. And I will say that this is certainly consistent with what other people are finding. So if you were to look at Bob Putnam's social capital benchmark study, his indicators of social capital, and he doesn't use the same terms, but fall into 4 categories: it's trust, formal participation, alteration, and informal interaction. He doesn't do a lot to explore shared norms, but that is a portion of the body that's out there. And so, so we look at this incredible body of archival research and say, there's really something for everyone. Regardless of how we go back to the beginning of the presentation, regardless of how you define social capital, there has been an exorbitant amount of research and data that exists out there that's just ripe for the plucking. And so let's spend a couple minutes talking about using archival research for purposes of social capital, because I've really become a big fan. It's the majority of the research that I'm doing these days, and there's some real advantages to it. At the very least, for those of us who have constrained time and constrained budget, it really gives the opportunity to punch above your weight in terms of sample size or geography. I mean, I'm able to reach audiences that I wouldn't have been able to reach if I were conducting my own original research. It's a very pragmatic approach. I teach at a teaching institution, the University of Southern Indiana, which is where I have my primary appointment. Faculty here teach a 4-4 teaching load. So they teach 4 classes a semester, which is a lot for an American university. Making time to do original research is challenging. As Tristan said, I'm currently serving as the assistant dean for the college. There are significant administrative responsibilities. But at the same time, I really have a genuine desire to be intellectually engaged, to be active in the creation of knowledge, and the use of archival data creates an opportunity to do that. And especially when I was in my pre-tenure period, when there were expectations that I'd be turning out research in a steady stream, archival data made that possible in a way that it probably wouldn't otherwise. For those of us that study archival data, the availability is, for those of us who say social capital, the availability is a tremendous advantage. There is plentiful data on social capital. If you are a member of ICPSR, to go out and look at these data archives, I wouldn't go so far as to say the majority of studies include social capital variables, but I would certainly say a significant portion include variables that give us some indication of social capital dynamics. And so it's there, so let's make use of it. And then lastly, it's real world. I do some experimental research, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later, but the critique of experimental research is it's not real world, whereas a lot of this archival data is collected in the field, and I value what that brings. And that's not to sugarcoat the advantages of archival research or using existing data. There are significant disadvantages that every researcher needs to confront. At the most basic level, archival data is never precisely what one wants or expects. Given this, the investigator is challenged to do what is possible given the time and resources in shaping the data according to their needs, right? So here's a couple of examples of that. And I'm going to encourage people, we've got a chat box opened up. I'm going to encourage people to answer some questions in that chat box. So the first question is, if you are interested in community level trust, so if you want to know whether or not people in a community trust each other, how would you measure it? So how would you measure community level trust? So I'm going to give people an opportunity to just kind of type some things in that chat box, and we'll talk about some of those. Okay, so it's the accountability, crime, safety perception. Civic participation. So kind of the logic that people who are engage, develop that trust, voting and canvassing. Chris has got all kinds of ideas. Okay, we'll go back to the archival data. Emily says we'll use the GSS trust question. And that's probably one of the most common measures of trust. But again, that's individual data. So if we do what Emily suggests, we have to then aggregate that to the community level. And depending on what our unit of analysis is, if we want to analyze states, that works really well. But if we want to analyze neighborhoods, that makes it more difficult. The World Values Survey. So again, that very similar dynamic to using that GSS survey. So I will say often, if we're talking about this community level research, I have used crime rates. Let's see, who was it that used crime rates? Chris mentioned using crime rates. Yeah, let me tell you, if I was kept awake at night by a methodological problem, my willingness to use crime rates as a proxy for trust would be the thing that keeps me awake. It's just not a good measure, right? Are crime rates related to trust? Yes, there's been significant amounts of research that says neighborhoods, communities, cities that have higher crime rates have lower trust. Are crime rates social capital? I think that's a highly suspicious claim, right? And so, when we're using archival data, we make these proxy-based assertions. I think we have to really be honest about what that does or does not tell us. Does it tell us something? I believe it does. I think it's better than nothing, but I think that we have to be careful about that. Let's do another one. How about shared norms? If you want to measure shared norms, how would you measure shared norms? And you can go ahead and enter it in the chat box. People are slow to answer, and that's okay. I'll tell you what, because I've had a lot of conversations about this, trying to struggle. Okay, so again, we have some reliance on civic organizations. We can measure expectations. That's an interesting proposition. Again, you're going to have to kind of get at individual levels, but you could extrapolate that out to a community level. So we've been some colleagues and I. Okay, so clubs, religious denomination. All right, so religious denomination is probably as close to anything that I've been using for shared norms. We've been really talking about this idea of plurality. And so we look at communities and attempt to understand how homogeneous is the community in terms of some indicator, whether that's partisanship or race or religion, and saying if the community is demographically similar, then there is a sense of shared norms. Again, is demographic homogeneity the same thing as social capital? No. But does it tell us something that we can then kind of dig into? Hopefully others can replicate. Hopefully, right? So we have this problem of archival data that it's never really what we want it to be, right? We're kind of stuck with these measures that exist. The second part of that is that the data at hand reflects the perspectives of the original investigators, as expressed in their research questions, data collection processes, analytical techniques. They also reflect the perspectives, whether they're scientifically or culturally, of the researcher and the time that they're working. I think the social capital benchmark study is a great example of this. It's a great study, but it's funded by those communities that it studies. And it's very pragmatic in terms of getting research done, but it also constrains the ability to really make more generalizable claims, because my gut feeling is that those communities that pay to be part of this study are different than communities that wouldn't pay to be part of this study. And then the last thing that I would say is that we have to be aware that the rationale for using archival data has to be based on the strengths of the data, right? And so if you are like me and you're using archival data, I really want to challenge you to not try to overly defend that or disarm it, but or ignore the weaknesses, but rather to recognize what those weaknesses are and then talk about how this is just kind of one step forward in the building of knowledge. And so, while archival data has lots of problems, it has enabled us to really think about and find some things empirically that I think enhance our understanding of social capital. And so, so one of the things that's interesting to me, and I'm going to talk about two sets of findings, is about the relationship, again, between social capital and economic development, which is really where the, excuse me, where the substantive focus of my research has been, is that there's this question of directionality, right? So that there are some who have looked at how economic activity influences social capital, and there's others who have looked at how social capital influences economic activity. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through these theoretically, and then I'm going to loop back around and talk about some of the empirical findings that I and others have found. So when we think about economic activity and social capital, we're thinking about the different types of economic development strategies that communities use in order to foster economic development. So first, the level of social capital does vary within and among industrial sectors. So if you look at different industries, industries that employ homogeneous groupings in tight-knit labor settings, and small businesses that rely on closed communities for funding and customers produce greater social capital than those industries that do not. And so that's kind of one way to think about this. You might also think about it in terms of Michael Porter's work on industrial clusters. He suggests that kind of communities invest in particular industries and create homogeneous industries, right? So local communities use community characteristics to attract a particular occupational grouping that will serve as a source of development for their community. And as a result, these occupations tend to cluster within particular cities, towns, counties, metropolitan areas. And this has an effect, right? So the communities often target specific occupations based on a range of options. These could be their ability to be captured, their high relative employment growth rates, their connectivity across growth rates, their fit with the local economy, their potential for entrepreneurship. And thus, these occupational-based targeting economic development strategies not only relate to economic benefit, but they relate to the social dynamics. Right? Cluster strategies attract individuals with a common background who are thus more likely to develop social capital. Additionally, the economic benefit of clusters is predicated on the logic that individuals in different organizations communicate with each other, right? So we have a community of all these similar people. And when you have that, that creates that connection. Right? So we've got these kind of industrial mix and industrial cluster strategies of economic development. The other area that's received some attention is infrastructure projects. So you might think about how cultural infrastructure projects, such as performing arts venues or soccer stadiums, contribute to the social capital of a community. And so while a lot of policymakers will advocate these projects as a means of creating jobs or attracting tourism dollars, there really is an economic impact that goes along with this. There's a social capital dynamic that comes along with this. There's these spillover effects, and I'll tell you, here as kind of as a personal example. So my wife is from St. Louis, which is home of the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team. So we are Cardinals fans, right? It is part of the identity. And I have a 12-year-old daughter who is a Chicago Cubs fan, right? This is her first act of disobedience in the family is to root for a different baseball team. And I'll tell you, that the identity elements associated with supporting one team over the other are strong, right? So we can think about how in these communities, these infrastructure projects create a social dynamic, right? And that plays out in research. There's been some early research, 1970s, that discuss how baseball teams have pretty minimal economic impact, but they serve as a significant source of community pride and lead to a greater sense of community in the communities where they operate on them. And in the same way, you might think about how a grand opera house or a performing arts venue might serve to build capital for community elites within a community. So we have these kind of mix of social capital strategies. Okay, so that's where we're kind of thinking about the direction of economic activity on social capital. We might also think about how social capital influences economic activity. So certainly the conventional theory here is that social capital creates community ties that facilitate, encourage economic development. And much of the contemporary work on social capital has been built on Granovetter's concept of embeddedness. He suggests that economic activity is embedded in social relationships in modern industrial society. And that the stronger personal relationships are in society, the less problematic market failure becomes, right? So if we have these connected communities, we don't have to worry about market failure as much. But there are some other perspectives as well, right? So we can think about the communitarian view, which is advocated by Putnam and others, that sees social capital as rooted in clubs, associations, and groups. And so these intermediate organizations serve an important role in building trust. And this trust serves to facilitate economic development. You might think about the network view that looks at horizontal and vertical ties, both bridging and bonding ties of social capital, the connections amongst individuals. And under this body of research, economic development becomes the product of the size and strength of social capital. We can think about the institutional view. The institutional view, it really fits better with the other direction, right? So we see that social capital is the product of political, legal, and institutional context. Social capital is a dependent variable and not an independent variable, as it is with networks and communitarian views. But at the same time, I would take it a step further that the institutional view is a great view for thinking about not only the direct effect, but the indirect effect, right? So how do political, legal, and institutional contexts affect economic outcomes? They affect them through the social capital. So it becomes a moderating or mediating relationship. And then lastly, the synergistic view, which sees government and citizen action as complementary, embedded. And so different social characteristics arise out of different combinations of institutions. Woolcock and Narayan have done some work on this, and they say that well-functioning governments with low bridging social capital lead to social societies characteristic by exclusion. While dysfunctional states with high bridging social capital create societies focusing on coping, right? So if we want to understand these dynamics, we have to understand not only the social capital, but how it fits with the general institutional identity of the community. Okay, so that's the theoretical framework that we might use to think about directionality. Let's take a look at some of the empirical findings. Okay, this is some research that I've done. So we'll start with what I think is the less interesting of the results. And so I'm going to ask a question. The question is, does the economic mix of a community appear to influence the social capital of that community? Does the economic mix of the community appear to influence the social capital of the community? And this was my first topic, right? This is what I did for my dissertation. It's an eight-year study, three-wave data using archival data from the International City County Management Association's Economic Development Study, the United States Census data, a number of other archival sources. And it looks at economic development strategies in 700 cities, and links those to labor outcomes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, civic outcomes of the American Community Survey, and the National Annenberg Election Study. And I look at 4 different types of strategies: infrastructure strategies, that, like I mentioned earlier, Economic incentives, those are really those industrial mix strategies. Entrepreneurship strategies like small business incubators are street level culture, things like Richard Florida's approach to kind of creating vibrant places as a means of building economic opportunity. So why don't we go ahead and launch poll 2, and I want you to guess which of these has the biggest impact. Oh, here we go. So here's your poll. Which of these infrastructure projects, financial incentives, entrepreneurship, and street level, which has the biggest effect on social capital? Oh, and I guess I should mention that we looked at a pretty wide range of social capital indicators. We looked at democratic knowledge, civic and political participation, trust, membership in organizations. Oh, this looks like this is still poll 1. So it looks like this is still poll 1. Can we get poll? Is there a way to get poll 2 up there?
I'm trying.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll 2. Okay, in poll 1, let's try poll 2.
At the top. Okay, good. Got it.
Oh, there we go. All right, so if you voted, you have to vote again. Interesting. Coming out strong in the beginning for Richard Florida. All right, I'll give you count down to 5. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, pretty close connection between entrepreneurship and street level culture. And certainly, the street level culture has received the most attention in this area. Richard Florida's work has been incredibly influential in terms of thinking about these indicators. I must admit, I didn't get to vote, but if I was going to vote, my initial hypothesis is I had a lot of faith in these cluster strategies. I thought when you had these fairly consistent, occupationally consistent industries, that would have a positive social capital effect. Okay, we see infrastructure is receiving a lot of, entrepreneurship is receiving the most votes, kind of based on the logic that those relationships are really important for entrepreneurial activity. Okay. So the question is, does the economic mix of a community appear to influence the social capital of that community? And the answer is not very much. So you really couldn't get this question right, because this was it's the thing that every dissertation doesn't want to happen, which is nothing is significant, right? We look at these side by side. We look at them in different types of communities, small communities, large communities, no analysis. The strategy of economic development has almost no effect on social capital, regardless of the community. And regardless of the measure of social capital that you're talking about, whether we're talking about civic knowledge or democratic participation or membership in groups and organizations, there is no pattern across 700 communities in terms of how their economic development strategy impacts social capital. And the lesson that I took away from this is really one of path dependence, right? That social capital is something that comes from a historical trajectory. And what's happening over an 8-year period just really can't move the needle. Okay. So let's kind of move on and look at that other direction, which ends up being a lot more interesting. Because there has been a real body of knowledge that has emerged suggesting that social capital does influence economic development. You know, the first study, you know, what most people call the Italian study, the Putnam, Leonardi, and Nanetti study, that finds that regional economic development is related to social capital, that Northern Italy and Southern Italy differ from each other regionally, and that the effect of these social capital dynamics has meaningful impact in terms of their economic development. You might look at Whiteley 2000, which suggests that trust has a significant impact on endogenous economic growth in those communities. This third study is a study of US counties, and they find that civic institutions per 10,000 individuals is positively and significantly correlated with growth in per capita income. And then this last study, which is probably the most recent study on this topic, which is an Economic Development Quarterly, finds that trust, membership in regional associations, and having homogeneous regional and cultural values have a positive effect on partnerships and the willingness to form partnerships and to create economic activity. And so there is a consistent pattern emerging here. And it appears across geographic boundaries. So whether we're talking about national regions, countries, counties, metropolitan areas, there is a pattern that social capital does shape the economic outcomes. And that social capital matters, even considering a range of different measures, right? Kind of going back to that theoretical orientation. It's not just civic groups, it's not just trusts, that these different indicators have effects, and they actually have different effects. And so let's move on to some of my own research. This is research that I've done with Barry Rubin that looks at the 50 largest municipalities in the United States. And we try to understand in a more detailed way how social capital impacts per capita income and job creation. So those are our two measures of our dependent variable, per capita income and job creation. And just for those of you that may not be as familiar with the context, the top 50 metropolitan statistical areas covers about 60% of the total US population. So we're able to make some claims about a pretty large group. The findings in this study, again, are based on archival data, US Census Bureau data, county business pattern data, per capita income data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And we use what I think is really an important methodological contribution of this study is we use shift share analysis. And so we're able to remove any sort of regional or industry level effects. And so what do we find? What do we find? So let's launch poll 3. We've got 3 measures of social capital. We look at segregation in these communities, the level of segregation. We look at the number of nonprofits. We have per capita volunteer hours. We have the per capita number of groups in those communities. Which of those do you believe matters most for economic development? And I'll tell you in advance, this is not a trick question. That some of these do matter more than others, and a lot of them do matter, and matter in meaningful ways. Okay, give you 5 more seconds if anybody wants to jump in. All right, so we have the most popular being number of nonprofits with a near close second of per capita number of groups, followed by volunteer hours and segregation. I will tell you, you did pretty well. You did pretty well. Let's take a look at the results. And here is the thing that is, what was shocking to me, not so much as the findings, but was the degree of findings. Okay. So, and this was a model that had a lot of statistical controls. There were over a dozen statistical controls. We controlled for all of the most common indicators of economic development. And here's what we found. The four biggest predictors of economic development in a community was number one, education, which should not be surprising to anyone. But number two was social capital. And these are standardized coefficients, followed by the number of professionals, followed by the level of manufacturing in those communities. Okay. And here, social capital refers to or what we call bridging social capital, which is per capita number of groups. So the per capita number of groups was the most important thing. And it mattered not as much as education, but pretty close. I mean, I was shocked at how important this was in terms of explaining job creation. That social capital mattered a lot. It mattered more than professionals, and it mattered more than the size of the manufacturing sector, which were indicators that are really tried and true indicators in economic development research. So let's walk through some of the other points just for your curiosity. Interestingly, segregation had no effect on either job creation or per capita income. Okay. The number of nonprofits did increase jobs, but not as much as the number of nonprofits relative to the population. Right. So the sense that there's this overlapping networks seems to matter. Okay. Per capita volunteer hours had no effect, no statistical effect on either income or job creation. And I really struggled with this. I didn't expect to find this, and ultimately the interpretation that we came down to was that although volunteering may increase skills, civic skills, and social networks, that there are time substitution involved. So if I spend more time volunteering, I'm spending less time in the creation of economic capital or job creation. That's a theory, but where we kind of ended up explaining this. So in other words, volunteering intensively for one organization, which was our measure of social capital, has no statistical effect on per capita income or creation. But when nonprofits are understood as gathering places that bring people together, especially diverse constituents, right, this bridging effect, that's where we really found it mattering. And now my research has really tended to focus on communities, but I would say there has been some similar supporting evidence looking at personal well-being. So a lot of you are probably familiar with some of this early research that's been done on Korean rotating credit associations. I really actually like this research that suggests that ethnic enclaves create an opportunity for people to access financial capital for purposes of economic growth. There's been some research that's done looking at entrepreneurship activity and the way that migration patterns in China lead to economic opportunities. There's been some work that was done in Chicago that looked at prestige among lawyers as it relates to social capital. There was a nice study that I found that looked at Dutch managers. The more social capital they had, their better ability to find high-paying jobs. But a lot of this is an understudied topic. So again, for those of you who are grad students out there and are looking for the next big topic, I think this is an area that's ripe for the picking. But it's challenging because social capital is so intertwined with human capital that the ability to really understand what's a predictor and what's a consequence requires some sophisticated methodology. So let me kind of go back to my research on communities with an experiential example. Okay, so if I think I live in a community, so this is a map of the community, this is Evansville, this is where I live. Right? You can think about how I'm connected to a set of individuals. And those relationships help me gain access to knowledge and resources, which have the potential to create an economic benefit for me. Right? So that's the individual story. If we think of me as being part of a community, I'm part of a larger network. And this network creates economic benefits, not only for me, but for those who are in my network and whom I want to be successful. So we have a broader range of resources. And there's both these kind of individual and community effects. But at the same time, the connectedness is what's really important in terms of understanding the economic dynamic. So if I take one person out of that model, instead of having one network for purposes of creating economic opportunity, we have two distinct networks that aren't able to tap into each other's resources, right? So we think about how those connections might matter. And I think, and this is, kind of, we're getting towards the end of the presentation, this has a lot of policy significance. So we had an article that came out in PAR that is not empirical. But what we say is, let's take a look at all of this research that's been done on economic development and social capital, and what might be the lessons that communities can take. What does this look like from a practical standpoint? So one, we start with assessing community social capital. Right? So communities should invest in understanding what are the social capital dynamics. The first step in utilizing social capital to achieve economic development is to understand what the social capital is like in that community. And to think strategically requires understanding those strengths and weaknesses of that social capital, which leads us to step two, kind of creating those intentional connections. Making sure that the right people are connected to facilitate that economic development. Most social connections happen haphazardly as a result of shared interest or community history or mutual purpose. What we are arguing for is that communities think intentionally about building those connections, right? So if you're in a community that looks like this, being intentional to turn it into a community that looks like this. Okay, lesson three, expanding the economic development network. So, if we think about how economic development happens in a lot of communities, there's the usual players. There's the major employers, there's the Chamber of Commerce. They may include educational institutions, but what we are arguing for is a broader approach, thinking about how can you include other organizations that have historically not been involved in economic development activity, schools, primary through high schools, churches. One of the things that, if you haven't seen Sean Safford's work on why the Garden Club couldn't save Youngstown, it's a beautiful piece of qualitative research. And basically what he says is it's not all groups matter. Some groups matter more than others. And groups, in his case, the Boy Scouts, serve as a place that brings diverse people together in a way that a garden club doesn't, right? And I think of churches and schools as filling this role. And so why not include them in economic development planning? And then lastly, we make a claim that we should reduce barriers through social capital and information formation. So, it's been previously suggested that improved economic development comes from helping a community overcome barriers, especially barriers to information. And social capital reduces these barriers in four ways: by increasing knowledge of financial capital, by reducing citizen opposition to economic development activities, by reducing bureaucracy that hinders economic momentum, and by enhancing the managerial expertise to put resources to more productive ends. And so if we invest in social capital and we invest in information flow, by reducing barriers between people and between groups, this has the potential to have an economic payoff. So that's the overview. That's social capital and economic development. I know we've gotten some questions in advance, and we're nearing the end of an hour, but I'm happy to stay on as long as people want to and answer some questions.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Trent. Really fascinating presentation. So as Trent mentioned, we have some time for questions now. Feel free to put some questions in the chat if you would like. Otherwise, you can raise your hand and we can get to your questions. Marion, were there any questions in the chat through the presentation that we can get to first?
No, I posted one earlier, but I'll let the other questions go first and I'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, well, I think the only other questions we have at this stage are the ones that were submitted in advance. Trent, from that list, is there anything that you would like to reply to?
Let me pull those up. I'm happy to respond to all of them. I'm going to stop my share.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
All right, so the first question I got, so in the social capital theory, there are many definitions to explain social capital. Which one do you like? Like I said in the beginning, I don't have a front runner. What I do have is I preference approaches that emphasize that resource-driven, capital-based approach. Second question, David asked, what do you see as the key motivators for building social capital in organization? Are they extrinsic, intrinsic, or a combination of both? You know, what I would say, you know, my answer to that question is really, I would guess that for most people, social capital isn't intentional. Right? There's not an extrinsic motivation or an intrinsic motivation. It's what happens while life is happening. That said, there are certainly lots of extrinsic and intrinsic reasons why you would want to do that. So that's that question. Oh, I liked this question. So this is a little bit of a long question. So Matt from Canada asked, imagine you had a small window cleaning business of 10 employees, 8 window cleaners, 1 office administrator, and an owner-operator who is a full-time general manager. From a value standpoint, how should a small business owner think about social capitalistic approaches to their business from a compensation standpoint? And there's more to the question, but clearly he's concerned about paying his employees a living wage, but also making sure that there's a robust social capital within the organization. And so when I'm not researching social capital, I also teach human resources. And so compensation is an area that's near and dear to my heart. And when I think about compensation, I think about 3 things. I think about internal equity, right? So is what we're paying people fair inside of the organization. External equity, are we paying people in a way that is competitive with the marketplace? And third is, what is their value to the organization? And I think that Matt's question is really thinking about internally, but I want to answer it in a little different way, because I want to answer it in terms of externally, right? So if we have individuals in our organization who are socially, capitally connected, right, that creates value for our organization. And I would place an economic premium on that. Right? So if I have employees that are connected outside of the organization, that's valuable to me, and I'm willing to pay them more for that than individuals who perhaps go home at the end of the day and don't have a large social network, who aren't widely connected. We've got a question from Ethiopia. How can we measure the impact of social capital on economic development at the household level? Traditionally, I either measure it as household income or per capita income, and there are trade-offs involved in those options. So those are the questions I think we got in advance. So let me see. Kind of maybe you can give me some guidance in terms of what you want me to respond to in the chat.
Yeah, so some questions coming through in the chat. So Aminal asks, the title of your presentation is too attractive, like putting honey in milk. How can you put capital in social capital? What are the obstacles?
Well, I think the obstacles are perhaps kind of going back to my question of archival data. The obstacle is convenience, right? When you're using other people's measures, there is a need to settle for what they've done. But I would argue with some intentionality, right? So if we start our research from the standpoint of not only are we looking at the relationship between social capital and some independent variable, but does that independent variable flow from that social capital as a goal, right? As a product to be produced, whether that's better health or economic gain or job opportunities, right? But being intentional that it's about the production of something, the goal of something, and thus the use of social capital to that end. I mean, to me, that's the capital dynamic.
And I think it seems like a really worthwhile thing for us to be doing, because when I look at the social capital research that's out there, and I've reviewed hundreds of papers and hundreds of different methodological approaches, it does seem like there's a lot of researchers just almost pluck different proxies out of thin air. They sort of go, oh, we're going to look at mobile phone ownership as a proxy for bridging social capital. And, they sort of lose sight of what social capital really is, and that productive, positive, beneficial component of what social capital is that makes social capital capital.
Right.
And so I think, like, building on Aminul's question about it, your 2017 study, when you're looking at a variety of different methodological approaches to measuring social capital, like, as you were going through it, were you thinking as part of that process about the underlying theory, about the justifications that the researchers were using for choosing different methodological approaches? I guess one part of the question is, was that deliberately part of your investigation? And if it wasn't, did you sort of become aware of it as you went?
Well, yes. Yeah. I would say it probably, I would say it was unavoidable, right? I mean, as you review these comments and they make these claims about what social capital is and what social capital does, you have to ask yourself the question, is that social capital? And two, how likely is it that it works that way? I mean, I'll tell you one thing that we intentionally did not do in that study is evaluate the merit of the different measures. But I wouldn't do that in a public forum, but I'm willing to do it privately. I look at this list, and so let's say here are 10, 15 measures of trust. Certainly some of them have more soundness to them than others. And I understand why people have used them, often out of convenience, but that doesn't necessarily, the theoretical justification isn't always strong.
But it's also incredibly difficult to evaluate those things. And I think you made the point in your presentation as well, that quite often these things tell us something. They might not tell us a great deal. There might be some concerns about validity, but there is some value that we can see in these measures. And so I've kind of been down the same path as you, where I've kind of tried to evaluate these measures and really try and pull them apart. But I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, partly because there's so many different ways of finding explanation in the world. So who am I to say this is an invalid way? Because it's not really invalid. It's just that perhaps it's not as strong as some other ways of doing things.
Right. And I would make an argument, and this is a larger conversation of the field of social science, is this is where triangulation and replication come in, right? So we're finding different measures of social capital coming to different conclusions. Then I am more cautious about those interpretations than we find different measures of social capital coming to the same conclusion. And if we find researchers using similar methods coming to the same conclusion, that is less encouraging to me than we find researchers with different methods coming to the same conclusion, right? And so thinking about it as the communal production of knowledge, I think is really important.
Because it seems to be a real challenge for people who are doing the peer reviews for social capital research that's being published, is to do that kind of evaluation. I'm in that position. I'm sure you're in that position where you're doing peer reviews. It is actually really difficult. The author is claiming that mobile phone ownership is associated with bridging social capital. There's no real evidence to support that. So do we reject the paper? Or do we allow them to continue with this empirical research that is gathering some information? You know, there is evidence being developed, but it seems pretty weak.
Yeah.
Not really a question there, I guess. Like, it's a real challenge, I think.
And I think that, you know, then maybe this is what's the lesson for reviewers. I mean, as I look, you know, around the Zoom room, I would be surprised if none of us have ever submitted an article and not gotten a response back that says, make clear your theoretical arguments. Right? You know, make clear your theoretical argument. Even my undergraduate students, like I always say, well, how do we prove causation? You know, and some proofs of causation are based on three things, right? So association, time order, and kind of a lack of a third variable. I always include the fourth option. You know, in order for me to prove causation, I want there to be association, time order, lack of a third variable, and a theoretical justification for why that would make sense. And if there's not that theoretical justification, then I am highly suspicious that any measure is meaningful. Right? And as reviewers, we can help the researchers bring that out in their writing.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really challenging with social capital is there's almost always a third variable, and probably fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh as well. And it sort of speaks to the complexity of these social processes in these social environments, that it's very difficult to try to say that, well, participation in voluntary association results in increasing trust. Well, there's clearly some other variables involved. So we can't really just demonstrate causality just in a simple way, like some people try to. And
I would also add, another thing that makes that challenging is, that sometimes social capital is thought of as an individual phenomenon, and sometimes it's thought of a group phenomenon. And you have a great, I was complimenting Tristan earlier on his website. So if you've not seen the website he has, it's definitely worth seeing. And there's a section where it kind of talks about this debate. And that has important methodological implications, because if we think of there as being group dynamics to that, then how do you do survey research of a group? That adds a whole nother level of trying to prove this causal argument.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been sort of dominating questions for a bit. There are a few more questions in the chat, so we'll get to another one. This is from M, can't see the full name. Mm-hmm. Can social capital be used for poverty alleviation or reduction?
This is Emily, I think.
Okay, yep.
Correct? M?
Actually, I think Emily's got the next question. The one about poverty reduction.
Okay, sorry.
Initials MB. I would say yes, and I actually think I've got it both an empirical and an anecdotal example. I'm not going to remember the study, but there has been some empirical work that has looked at poverty reduction, mostly in the third world, and finds that there are social capital effects on poverty reduction. But I'm also going to provide a more anecdotal example. There's been what's sometimes called the groups movement, which is an economic development or poverty reduction strategy that I've seen in a lot of communities in the United States, where they create these intentional groups between people who have resources and don't have resources. And they're mostly food-based, right? So the requirement for participating in a group is you have to come and break bread together. And what they find that happens in these groups, and they're usually driven by nonprofits, is people who don't have jobs, who don't have education, who don't have the opportunities to create economic opportunities for themselves, in building relationships with people over a meal, learn about jobs, they get introduced to people. And so I think this works both at the individual and societal level.
Yep. Emily, did you want to ask the next question? Did you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Hi there. Thank you. That's been really interesting to listen to. I'm just wondering if you have any specific views on the more exclusionary side of social capital. So where it's maybe not overtly, but where it's maintains a status quo within a community, Particularly, I'm interested in social class and gender diversity, but also kind of ethnic diversity.
Yes. So again, this is a question that we might think about at both the individual and the group level. I think your concern at the individual level is undeniable. And in fact, we use the term the old boys club, right? That there's an actual club, that old boys belong to, and that's just a turn of a phrase, but it clearly gets at the sense that there are groups who sometimes, as a matter of policy, but oftentimes as a matter of practice and history, are fairly homogeneous, and to the degree to which those are create obstacles for people's economic development outside of the group. I think there's a very clear argument to be made there. The interesting thing to me about the community level is that while though that may be advantageous for individuals who are members of those groups, that negatively impacts communities, right? So kind of going back to Sean Safford's work on the Garden Club and why I couldn't say Youngstown, that he makes a very intentional point that for these groups to have community level economic outcomes, those groups have to be cross-cutting. It's the cross-cutting nature that leads to the community level economic incentive.
Oh, great. We've got another question come up in the chat. Sorry, I can't pronounce your name. Excellent presentation. Could we capitalize on citizens' social work as an incentive so that they can cash in and strengthen social capital in local communities? Shouldn't we try to make it something tangible and concrete for citizens as a currency, for example?
Can you help me understand a little bit more what you mean by social work?
So it seems like quite a critical question. Like a lot of people want to go beyond social capital just as an indication of the social and cultural factors being positive and beneficial, and try and actually put monetary terms on it. So the response there was work for mutual benefit. Okay,
so kind of incentivizing that. And maybe I don't have a strong answer to this question. I think social capital is easy to facilitate and hard to incentivize. I think that we can be intentional and we can about how we form these social connections. But it's been my experience that forced social capital rarely has much of a lasting impact. That said, maybe that's not a problem, right? I mean, I have we go back to the Girl Scout examples. Whether I like my coworkers or not probably doesn't matter if they're going to buy cookies from me or from my daughters. That the fact that we are forced into these situations has an economic impact, whether we are amenable to them or not. That's a tough question. I don't have a good answer for that question.
Well, perhaps a related question is the Chinese social credit system, which seems like an incentivized way of effectively building social capital, trying to encourage people to do pro-social things for other people in ways that I think we could talk about as being social capital. Are you familiar with the Chinese system?
I'm not, and I would love to hear about it. I actually lived in China for 2 years, and so I'd be interested in learning more. Can you tell us a little?
I actually wrote an article on this that's on the website, socialcapitalresearch.com, where I looked at it a little bit just to try and see whether being very deliberate and purposeful about encouraging people to be pro-social, whether or not that really would represent creating true social capital, or whether or not that intentionality would make people even more instrumental in the way in which they interact with others, which I think most people would agree isn't really what true social capital is about. You know, if we're looking out for our own self-interest, then that's perhaps it's a form of social capital, but it's not the sort of true, really beneficial, authentic form of social capital. And so I think my conclusion, having looked at the system, is that it could potentially create some norms of behavior that are pro-social towards other people, but it's probably more likely to create further self-interest and people basically gaming the system for their own personal and individual benefit, which I don't think would necessarily be a positive thing in the long run.
What are some of the incentives that they're using?
Things like tax breaks, potentially, if you have high levels of credit, as a way to sort of measure your worth for potential employment, particularly in government positions. So there's a range of different ways in which having a high social credit can be of benefit, and having a low social credit could be a disadvantage.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think any time I think maybe one of the points here is that we are very often deliberate about creating social capital, but we don't necessarily use the term social capital. You know, leaders in everything that they do are basically creating social capital. They're wanting to facilitate certain actions of individuals within their team. You know, they're wanting to encourage trust and certain norms that are beneficial. So, you know, we often do intervene in the creation or the nature of social capital, but we don't often use the term social capital. We don't necessarily, be really incentivize it and be very specific about it. And I think the biggest concern with doing so, and this Chinese social credit system perhaps is an example, is that incentivizing it could encourage people to act with self-interest, which is really not what social capital is about. Should we move on to the next question? I think, Marion, did you want to ask your question from earlier?
Oh, yes. It's so fascinating. I can't even remember what the question was.
I think it was about altruism.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm actually researching in the not-for-profit sector on social capital, etc. And I noticed that you said you would like to find another term other than altruism. Any ideas what that term might be? I'm researching directorships, etc., governance of these organisations. So altruism, yeah, it's problematic. Any hints about where you're headed in thinking about that?
I might call it civic engagement. That reflects a wide range of things like philanthropy and volunteerism and political participation. I mean, certainly all political participation isn't altruistically motivated. A lot of it's personally motivated. That might be a place to start. I think what my concern there is really about the fact that many people engage in these activities for reasons that may not be altruistic. And so I teach fundraising. I work with nonprofit organizations. I teach fundraising, and we spend a lot of time talking about getting corporate organizations to underwrite our charitable work.
Yep.
And so if I have a banquet and I get the Apple Corporation to provide me a grant to sponsor this banquet, and I put an apple on the front of the program and I put it on the website, right? Yeah.
Looks good.
It doesn't mean that Apple's not an altruistic organization, but I'm skeptical that altruism is the primary motivating factor. But that doesn't mean that that's not worthwhile for the organization. It doesn't mean that there aren't meaningful connections that come out of that interaction. So I want to be careful about, the fact that a lot of altruism isn't altruistic, and recognizing that as we talk about that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to really define. People seem to galvanize on it, but there's something happening in between, probably.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So there's another question in the chat from Camilla. Says, such a great presentation. I wonder, to pick up on Emily's question, to promote diversity on board leadership, how do you see social capital support board diversity when they are usually difficult to bridge the old boys networks?
So I think of board diversity as a two-step process. Okay. The first, recognizing Emily's question, that the old boys network often is an obstacle. I would actually say that social capital is rarely the thing that diversifies boards. External incentives are what diversify boards. Boards become diverse because a funder wants them to be diverse, because there are regulatory environments that require them to be diverse. It's usually something in the outside environment that forces that diversity, changing values of the society, force them to be diverse. So getting diverse people on the board is rarely a product of social capital. But I think there is a really important social capital dynamic, and that's kind of the second part of my answer, which is there was a great, one of the best studies I've read in the last few years. And it's kind of a social capital study, but it was a study that was done looking at for-profit corporations. And they wanted to know which for-profit corporations had the most effective boards. And they looked at the composition, they looked at the skill set, they looked at the age, they looked at whether or not they were insider or outsider board members. And you know what the thing was that mattered the most in predicting board effectiveness? It was the amount of time that the board spent doing non-board activities. So the more the board members played golf together, the more they drank beer together, the more they went to cocktail parties together, that was what led to performance changes in the board. And so I think that there is an important social capital lesson in this in terms of diversity, that, you know, while that diversity may be forced on the board from outside by funders or changing social values, that there is a role for boards to be intentional about how do they create unstructured opportunities for those people to work together. Right? The old boys club is going to get to better no matter what. But are you planning a social activity for your board so that those people who are maybe perhaps bringing diversity onto the board have an opportunity to get to know them, to make those connections where those connections may not seem automatic or natural because of differences in race or gender or nationality?
Seems like an incredibly important point. Camilla, did you want to add anything to that?
No, thank you. I'm sitting here in a Finnish sauna in Finland, and consider Finnish cultural context. It's so hard to break in with that communication culture style here. It's really conservative, and so I do believe what you said, that there is a lot of pressure coming in on Finnish board also to diversify. They're doing well on European level, but I'm now looking into European Women on Boards. It's an association in Brussels trying to diversify all European-wide boards, and it's a really uphill climb. And I guess there could be something also dealt with cultures, despite that being Nordic, feminine cultures, equality cultures compared to Europe. I mean, South Europe. But thank you for bringing those two coins. It's really fascinating to see what actually channels and brings change. Thank you.
Emily, did you want to add your point?
Yes, I was just wondering about how that translates over to an industry level. So the sector that I'm looking at is rock climbing and mountaineering leadership, which is heavily male dominated. And there aren't really the same kind of barriers to entry that you have if you want to become an airline pilot, where you have to have a lot of money. Actually, the entry barriers are quite low. So I'm wondering about, I actually added another item in the chat about your point that could be transferred to an industry level, I guess, with industry leaders or organizations in the industry being specific about providing unstructured opportunities for people within the industry to be able to meet and get to know each other. Do you have any other thoughts about that on a wider industry level?
You know, I don't. I guess what I would say is I think that the point that you're making is that there are these industry level characteristics that moderate the effects that we see is an important takeaway. You know, just as, you know, we see that community size in some sense moderates some of these effects of social capital and economic development. You know, we have to kind of understand the dynamics of that community, whether that's a geographic community or whether that's an industrial community. The picadillos that exist within that industry have to be considered, which perhaps, you know, is relevant for kind of Tristan's earlier comment about the challenge of studying these issues, because there get to be so many of these other variables that matter, and how do they interplay for the result.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think we're reaching the end of our time. If anybody has any final questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or put your hand up. I do have one final question for you, Trent. It's a little bit of either a difficult one or one that doesn't actually have an answer. So feel free.
I was hoping for an easy final question. But go ahead. I'll do my best.
You might just like to decline to answer it altogether, perhaps, or maybe there isn't an answer. Returning to definition just for a moment. When I read the definitions, I read a lot of definitions, and I never really feel satisfied with any of them that particularly suit, you know, where I can really say, oh yes, that's what social capital is. And I'm really happy with that definition. And quite often one of the challenges that I see in the definitions is that they're worded and geared towards positive outcomes, you know, for mutual benefit or for productive outcome, you know, some sort of positive wording. But we know that social capital isn't universally positive, and there can be negative outcomes from the same sorts of social processes that produce positive outcomes. They can produce negative outcomes. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about definition and how we might resolve that? Or if you have a definition you think does resolve that kind of issue?
Well, I don't. You're right. It is a tough question. And perhaps my answer is I might have somewhat of a different take on those definitions, in the sense that I understand them within the context of the group that we are being identified. So let's say we take a definition of social capital, that it says, you know, social capital involves, you know, relationships as a resource for producing a mutual benefit. You know, on the face, that seems to be pro-social, but as you recognize, right, you know, I might be a better drug dealer because of my social relationships than I would be without my social relationships. But I'm not sure that that's not a mutual benefit, right? I'm selling drugs, you are buying drugs, and so we both mutually benefit because of the relationships we have. Is that socially undesirable? Yes, it is socially undesirable. But I understand that kind of within the context of the relationships where those resources exist. If I'm a white supremacist, right? Are there negative social outcomes that come from that? Most definitely. But are there personal benefits that come from that, or benefits for the relationships in which I exist? I mean, I think that's true. They do. So there's kind of this trade-off between the large group, the small group, and the individual, and how we understand those definitional dynamics.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because for people to be engaging in any certain behavior or action, there needs to be some sort of benefit for themselves personally. And so there's always a winner with social capital. You know, we often talk about the downsides or negative aspects of social capital being, say, exclusion. But the flip side of exclusion is inclusion. Those people who are in the group, they clearly get some benefits, but it's often at the disadvantage or at the cost of those who are excluded. So I think it's a really valid point that there always are benefits. So there is maybe not mutual benefit, mutual among some people, but not necessarily mutual for everybody.
Yep.
Exactly. So I don't think any other questions have popped up. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for your presentation today. What we'll do now is we'll end the recording shortly, and people are welcome to stay on and have an informal discussion if they would like and bring up any further questions. But we'll release you, Trent, from your time commitment, and you're welcome to stay on if you want to any longer and disappear and drop out any time you like. So, but last thing I'll do before we stop the recording is just mention that the next webinar is actually going to be in a few weeks' time. It's going to be on the 29th of October, and it's going to be Professor Troy Glover from the University of Waterloo. And he's particularly going to be talking about the conceptual rigor of social capital and how we might be able to improve our understanding of different social capital forms that facilitate certain types of action. So I think he's going to be getting into a little bit of the sort of theory and conceptual approaches to social capital, which I think will be really, really interesting. So that's on Friday, the 29th of October. All right, that's it for now. I'll end the recording here. People are welcome